Hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's teach-in. I'm Professor Ralph Young in the Department of History. And what we're doing this semester is 5 of the teach-ins are going to be on the specific theme of politics, the Supreme Court, and democracy, and which would be examining the significance of the recent controversial Supreme Court decisions on reproductive rights, gun violence, immigration, and climate change. Next week's teach-in will be back on our usual Friday, and it'll be the Dean of the Beasley School of Law, Professor Rachel Rebouchet, on the Supreme Court and reproductive rights. I'm just admitting more people here. Okay, so today's teach-in is on climate change, Supreme Court and climate change. And Amy Sinden is a professor of law at the Temple University Beasley School of Law, where she teaches in the areas of environmental, climate, and natural resources law. She's also a member scholar of the Center for Progressive Reform in the American College of Environmental Lawyers. She has received various awards and accolades for her writings critiquing the overuse of economic theory in environmental law and exploring the application of human rights norms to environmental conflicts, which have appeared in a variety of scholarly, popular, and public policy publications. Mohammad Kiani is a professor of mechanical engineering at Temple, where he teaches in the areas of engineering economics, including the economics of climate change, experimental design, and bioengineering. For the past 25 years, his research has been continuously funded by major research grants, and he has served on a number of national and international scientific review panels. He has received several national and international awards for his work, and at Temple he has been the recipient of both the Faculty Research Award and the Lindback Foundation Award for Distinguished Teaching. So let me turn it over to them right now to start the teaching. I think Mohammad is going to begin.
Yes, so welcome everybody, good afternoon. The way we are going to do this, I'm going to do a quick introduction on the basic, very basic science of climate change and some of the basic fundamental scientific issues. And then I'm going to turn it over to Professor Sinden, who's going to do most of the talking and discussion on the legal implications of the decision, the recent decision by the Supreme Court and all the related issues. And of course, we'll be happy to answer any questions. So let me get this started. You can see my screen, right? Okay, so I want to quickly talk about some of the very basic science of climate change, some of the indicators, some of the economic impact that it's having on the society and in the world. So that before I do that, I want to just go through like a 30-second review of how science works, because a lot of people I feel like they don't really understand how science works and how this is not a matter of opinion. So in general, science is driven by evidence, not opinions. As I always tell my students, opinions are a dime a dozen. Everybody's got them, including me. And they're usually not worth much, to be honest. Evidence is what the name of the game is. Science is the process of using observation and experiments to draw evidence-based conclusions. Science is not just a body of established facts that you memorize. It's the best process we have for understanding the world around us, and it keeps changing. The scientific process is unique. Individual scientists are not necessarily geniuses who are sitting up there telling us what to do. I'm a relatively well-established scientist. I don't think of myself as particularly smarter than average. Anybody, I think especially anybody in this audience, could be a scientist. It just takes a little bit of work, but there is nothing unique about the people who do this. It's the process that's the unique and powerful. As I said, science is not a matter of belief or opinion. What you believe is irrelevant to the process of science. As I always say, people say, there are people who say Earth is flat, and you could say that, that's your opinion, but you're dead wrong when you say that. There's nothing, we're not putting you down or anything like that. It's just wrong. There's no evidence for anything like that. Science is not a supermarket. You can't pick and choose which parts of it you like and you accept. The same science that allows us to build airplanes and build cell phones and things like that is the same science that tells us you should wear a mask if you're in a confined area so you don't catch COVID. This is all the same body of science. You can't pick and choose different parts of it. And as I always say, what's unique about science is that, and engineering as it relates to science, is that this is the only field of human activity where you can build an airplane that actually flies, and you can develop a pill that actually relieves your headache, right? All these, conspiracy theories and all of that is fine, but they have never built an airplane that flies. They have never made a microphone that they can sit in front and deny science. So if you think about it, these people use microphone, electricity, electromagnetic transmission of waves and things like that, all developed by scientists and engineers to deny science and engineering. And that's the problem. That's the power of science. And then finally, this last statement is what many people don't understand about how science works, is that if all scientific explorations in one area or another start pointing in the same direction, then you end up with what's called the scientific theory. When people tell a scientist this is just a theory, that's the highest level of respect you can have for a scientist, because science is nothing but a bunch of theories. And a theory represents the consensus of the scientific community, meaning that the evidence for it is pretty clear and overwhelming. Scientific theories and scientific consensus are relatively rare, but when we have them, they are very powerful. So again, if you look at the example of the COVID, initially we didn't know whether masks worked or not, right? There were some data on one side, some data on the other side. Eventually, everything kind of boiled down to a consensus where now we know they do. And so when we have a consensus in the scientific community, it's very powerful. As I said, it's rare, but it's very powerful when we have it. Another quick point, ignorance is not ground for denial of science. People say, oh, I just heard about climate change. I don't know if it's real. Well, if you just heard about it, you're just ignorant about it. And politicians do this all the time. They say, oh, I just heard about climate change. I don't know about it. Well, you just are ignorant. This is an example that we've known about this for a long time. This is in June 24, 1988, cover of New York Times. And it says, global warming has begun, expert tells Senate. I remember this when I was in graduate school. I was reading about this. And so we've known about this for a long, long time. This is not new. I'll talk more about this. And if somebody doesn't know about it, they just need to get educated about it. So having said that, where do you get scientifically reliable information on climate change? You get it at places like World Meteorological Organization, American Meteorological Society, the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Engineering, American Association for the Advancement of Science. If you want to go outside the US, Royal Society of the United Kingdom, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and so on. You can also get it from a place like Climate Central. Climate Central is not a scientific organization per se, it's an educational organization. But if you look at their documentation, you see that they are backed by all the scientific organizations. They support them as an educational organization. Same thing with WX Shift. In fact, the consensus on climate change is so uniform and so strong that this is the challenge I've always had to the deniers. Can you name a single scientific organization anywhere in the world, not just in the US, anywhere in the world that does not support this consensus? And there is no such thing. All scientific organizations all over the world support this consensus. So you don't go to politicians for this. You don't go to rich people. I hope by now you know, just because you're rich doesn't mean you know what you're talking about. Bill Gates wrote a book about climate change a couple of years ago, full of errors and misrepresentations. Polls, doesn't matter what polls say. Talk shows, these people, these commentators, so-called commentators, they don't know what they're talking about. It's just a bunch of opinions. And I'm sure you have all good, nice friends. I have nice friends, but they probably don't know about climate change. And internet is a cesspool, essentially. It's not useful anymore. It has lost a lot of its usefulness. And the information you get from the internet is often inaccurate, incomplete, and so on. So having said that, what is the scientific consensus on climate change? That the climate of Earth is, we know that the climate of Earth is dangerously warming. We know that this rapid warming trend is happening now. This warming trend is primarily due to human activity, and some impacts of this warming trend are irreversible. However, action today can prevent further damage and maybe reverse some of the changes. Very basic science, 99% of gases in the atmosphere are nitrogen and oxygen. However, we have trace amounts of water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide that can keep warming the earth. If you think about the atmosphere has the property that it can trap essentially some of the heat from the sun. The average temperature of Earth is about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. If we didn't have an atmosphere, it would be 0 degrees Fahrenheit. So you can see the big difference that it can make. And as I said, science of climate change was established a long time ago. Female scientists were working on this, which was very rare in the 19th century. John Tyndall in 1863 said doubling CO2 would warm the Earth's surface. And Aaron Haas said that Arctic would warm by 15 degrees if CO2 doubled by 2 or 3 points. That was when the CO2 concentration was 295. Now it's actually more like 424 parts per million. So this is what we are seeing. We are seeing unprecedented increase in CO2 concentration, for example. There is some natural variation, but what we are seeing now is unprecedented. And on top of that, we are adding another 36 billion tons of CO2 to the atmosphere every year. And this is not just one measurement, or different measurements. If you model the temperature changes on Earth, the only way you can make the models agree with the observed information is if you include the anthropogenic or the human component in the model. Otherwise, the numbers don't match. And so if you look at the concentration of things like carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, you see that by the industrial age, they've been going up exponentially. About 82% of these gases is carbon dioxide, which comes mostly from burning of fossil fuel. 3% is fluorinated gases used in things like air conditioning and heating and cooling. 5% is nitrous oxide used in things like rockets and cars and industry. And then 10% of it is methane. So a gas like methane is much stronger global warming gas compared to carbon dioxide, but at least its half-life is shorter. So you have to kind of understand how these things work between the different types of gases. In terms of where the greenhouse gases in the United States come from, it's mostly from transportation, electricity, industry, commercial and residence, and agriculture. So, but if you think about it, if, for example, you look at agriculture, it's only 9% here, but if you understand that, for example, agriculture uses electricity and transportation also, agriculture then becomes actually more like 20%. So it depends how you cut the pie and how you present your data. In terms of scientific organizations, as I said, in the world, all support this consensus. And 99.9% of scientific research published in peer-reviewed journals find that human-caused climate change is happening now. So what we are seeing, as I said, is an increase in temperature, which is caused by this increase in carbon dioxide and other global warming gases. The thing that the chart that keeps me up at night is this one. In this one, if you pay attention, you see that all of the 10 hottest years on record globally have been after 2010. So every year we keep breaking records. And it has been more than 100 years since Earth has had a record cold year. Let me repeat that. It has been more than 100 years since Earth has had an overall record cold year. So we are not on the right track. We need to change our track. In terms of, so the question then becomes, where is all this energy going? It's being stored in the oceans, essentially. So when you're talking about global warming, you're talking about ocean warming. And the reason for that is that water has a higher heat capacity. We have a lot of water. Oceans are deep, 71% of surface with 4 kilometers deep. And then there are these currents in the ocean that essentially mix all the gases and heat. Most of the heat is stored in the upper 700 meters of ocean where all the marine lives are. So you see how problematic this situation is. On top of that, when you dissolve CO2 in acid, you form what's called carbonic acid, which makes the water more acidic for these marine life. So the oceans are 25% more acidic than they were compared to pre-industrial age. And the amount of heat that you're storing in this chart, you see that most of the heat is in the upper ocean and a little bit in the deeper ocean. The rest is pretty much insignificant. The amount of energy is huge. Zettajoule, for those of you who are not mathematically oriented, that's like 1 and 20 zeros in front of it. This is a huge amount of heat that's being stored in oceans. And as a result, you see that the oceans are going up. The temperature is going up in some places by 4 degrees. One result of that is that there is a significant sea level rise. We haven't had anything like this in the past, 1,000 years or even before that. And this is significant. If you look at the pictures of Arctic Sea, for example, you see that as time goes by, Arctic Sea is melting. And we actually now, for much of the year, we can actually have ships going through the Arctic Sea. And what are we doing with that? Oil companies are drilling for oil in these areas, which is madness. In terms of what's happening with all this water that's evaporating from the surface of the Earth, it's essentially being trapped in the atmosphere. So the atmosphere is becoming like tropical areas where you have a lot of water. Most of the time there's a drought, and then once in a while the atmosphere becomes unstable and you have huge amount of rain being dumped down, which is when you have floods. So you have either no rain or you have floods. For those of you who are big supporters of military spending, here is an example where this is running into trouble. The biggest Navy base in the world is in Norfolk. However, as the water is coming up, the Navy base is essentially being drowned by the water. And once or twice a month, they can't even service the ships using the streamlines. And the base gets cut off from land. So if you really want to, have a strong military, first you got to fix climate change, because without that, you're not even going to have a Navy base. And Philadelphia, the temperatures are going up. This is not a surprise to anybody. A personal example, I'm originally from Iran. I was born in the city of Isfahan, which is an ancient city, 2,500-year-old city, beautiful buildings, old buildings and stuff like that. The life of the city was this river, which was the size of maybe a little bit bigger than Schuylkill River. And this is what's left of it. You see this guy walking in the riverbed, and 2 of my childhood friends drowned at this point in the river. This used to be the life of the city. Now a city of 2-3 million people is dying, essentially, literally dying. And so if we don't listen to the science, this is coming to a neighborhood near you. This summer, we had Rhine River dry up in parts of Germany. We had the Thames River in England drying up, and so on. Now, this also affects the changes in temperature, pH, salinity, and so on, affects living systems by changing their range shift, timing of biological activity, growth rate, and so on. And this leads to fire risk, insects, and invasive species such as the lantern firefly that we have in Philadelphia now. If you look at the West, this is not all not all natural, in the sense that human policy and human behavior makes a big difference. The forests in the West, the fire that we have now in them is natural cowardice. It burns the old trees, replaces them with new trees. However, for the past 100 years, we keep putting down these fires because some rich person decides to go build a house in the middle of nowhere. And as soon as there's a fire, we have to put it down, risk the life of firefighters so that we can put this down. This provides fuel for the next fire, and it makes things a lot worse. On top of that, all the trees and stuff being damaged by climate change provide additional fuel to the whole system. And this is what the whole thing is about. In terms of the biological impact, there is more than 1 million plant and animal species that are now on the verge of extinction. This current level of extinction has not been seen since the time of dinosaurs. From 1970 to 2014, the size of vertebrate population in the world has declined by about 60% on average. So this is very serious. In terms of ecological impact, just a quick word about infections. As you know, there has been a trend of increasing emergence of infectious diseases such as SARS, COVID-2, MERS, and so on. The reason for this is that humans are coming in closer contacts with animals. About 70 to 80% of the diseases that we catch are what's called zoonotic diseases. These are diseases from animals. And so as we come closer to them, we catch their diseases. And then on top of that, there's massive concentration of domesticated animals for both food and pets, which infect us. Then there is a rapid rise in human population concentration and mobility. Everybody got to travel. Everybody got to go to an exotic time, and so you have pictures to put on Facebook to show everybody, right? And this essentially causes damage to the environment and causes transmission of disease. Lack of global investment in health and other infrastructure has then made these things a lot worse. So if we address climate change, we will reduce the likelihood of pandemics also in the future. So a little bit about economics. This is from a famous economist, Kenneth Boulding. He said, anyone who believes that exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. And if you think about our economic model, we always want to do more. We always want to produce more cars, more houses, more plastic junk, right? And so if we keep doing that, we are going to, this is not sustainable. If everybody wanted to have the standards of the American population, we would need 2 to 3 more Earths, resources of 2 to 3 more Earths to do this. This is clearly not sustainable. So if you think about it, all economic activity have a footprint. The fact that we are getting together on Zoom has a footprint, use of all computers, electricity, and so on. All sectors of the economy are being impacted. However, poor and vulnerable regions, as usual, are screwed, and screwed more than the usual. However, there are some short-term winners. For example, oil companies who are drilling in the Arctic, they're going to make some money in the short run. But I'm not sure if that's good for us as a whole. And the cost of this keeps going up, the cost of dealing with climate change. So we are paying for the damage, but we are not willing to fix the problem, which in the long run is cheaper to fix the problem than to pay for all these damages. So the money is there, we're just not spending it properly. And the money is not being spent evenly. So if you look at some of the states like Texas, Louisiana, and Florida, which have bad environmental policies, they actually take more of the money for dealing with climate change than the rest of the country. So we in Pennsylvania, for example, are subsidizing bad policies in Florida and Texas. Now, just a quick slide to finish up. If you think about where we are going, we want to stay under 1.5 degrees centigrade. That's at least a manageable level. Engineers and scientists can deal with that level of heating. However, at the current, we were originally on a very high path. At the current level, however, we've done better. At the current level, we're going to end up close to 2 degrees, which is not sustainable. We need to change course. And I know people say, oh, how do we do that? Well, only significant changes in policy will do that, which we are talking about today. So we have to support politicians and policies that address climate emergency. We have to, there is no magical technical solution that we can snap our fingers and fix this. We have to develop adaptation strategies and resilient infrastructure. We have to fulfill and strengthen international agreements. Individual actions such as reducing your meat consumptions, of course, make a difference. People used to say climate change is not real. Now the same people say there is nothing you can do about it. And both of those things are wrong. So delaying action will have disastrous consequences. The solution is to get involved, vote, and organize. And just to say the power of this, the law that just passed, the Inflation Reduction Act, before that, we only had about 24 to 35% reduction. We added another 31 to 44% reduction from the amount of gases that we are doing. If we had 2 more senators voting for a stronger package, we could have easily gotten to more like 60% reduction, which then you could sigh, you could breathe for a second and say, okay, now we have this somewhat under control. So we are making progress, just not enough. Sorry for going over time. I'm done. Dr. Sinden.
Phew, wow. My head is spinning, Mohammad. That was incredible.
Just one more thing. I know I went through a lot of material. Is that if anybody is interested, send me an email. I'll send you the more detailed version.
Thank you so much. But I guess, first of all, that image of the river in your hometown, really compelling. Wow. But that was a wonderful introduction. So much information packed in. You got any good news for us, Mohammad?
Yes, as I said, there is a solution. You just need to do it.
Yeah,
Just
well,
elect the people.
here's my worry. I think you're counting on me to give you the solution, right?
Exactly.
Give us the science. The science tells us we're in deep doo-doo. And now you're all looking at me at the law school. I'm supposed to say, what's the law going to do about it, right? What's the solution? Well, it's a really big problem. It's a global problem, of course. How do you deal with it? Well, if you step back and think about, how should the law deal with a global environmental problem? This is not the first global environmental problem we've had to deal with. Back almost half a century ago, scientists first started talking about the hole in the ozone layer. And there was a legal response, right? And the legal response took the form of countries all came together, entered into international negotiations. They agreed on a treaty. And then each country, treaty is great, but it's not like we have a world government that can directly enforce a treaty exactly. Well, that's all right. What do? Each country goes back to their national legislature and gets domestic legislation passed that implements the treaty, right? It's the common sense solution. It makes sense. And we did it with the Montreal Protocol to the ozone treaty. And in fact, the hole in the ozone layer is now shrinking, right? So that solution was super, super effective. And you started the same place that I'm going to start, which is way back at the sort of dawn of time, 1988. This was your New York Times front page, right? In a sense, back then, everybody assumed that's what we were going to do. Same thing we did for the ozone hole. We're going to do it for climate, right? And we're basically going to call on international negotiations backed up by legislation from the US Congress and its equivalents all around the world to solve the problem. And it begins 1988 with noted climate scientist James Hansen testifying before Congress, saying to the folks in Congress, this thing is real, it's really happening, and we got to worry about it, right? And it was pretty effective, I'll say, initially. That very same year, candidate H.W. Bush apparently had heard what James Hansen had to say. He says, those who say we're powerless to do anything about the greenhouse effect, forget about the White House effect, right? So he's all on board. This is a Republican president. He's going to do something about the climate crisis. And indeed, 4 years later, he goes to Rio, to the big international negotiations, and signs the treaty to solve the climate problem, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, right? Signed by George H.W. Bush, ratified by the US Senate. Excellent, right? So far, what I'm calling Plan A, right? We do what we did with ozone. We look to international treaties and the Congress to save us. It's going great. Everything's going great. Now, this UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, excellent treaty, still in effect, still the framework that governs all the international negotiations that happen on climate. It's a little vague. There were more details that needed to be worked out. There needed to be more specifics, and that's what Al Gore did when he went to Kyoto, Japan in 1997. Countries of the world came together and they came up with another treaty. Everybody agreed on the Kyoto Protocol, and it imposed enforceable specific emissions cuts on individual countries. Like you're gonna cut by 10%, you're gonna cut by 5%. It's very specific, very enforceable. Then what happens? Well, the Senate, the US Senate comes back and says, sorry, Al Gore, you may have signed this treaty on behalf of the US, but there's no way we're going to ratify it. And look at the vote on this. I mean, this is really striking. It's not like a Republican Democrat split. It's unanimous. every member of the US Senate that votes on this thing says, no, we are not going to ratify this global climate deal, right? Phew, what's happening at this point? Well, in part, the fossil fuel industry has kind of woken up, right, to what's happening and what this is going to mean for their bottom line. So they have unleashed, full-fledged lobbying campaign. Perhaps it's in part the results of that we're seeing in that 95-0 vote. They've also initiated an enormous public relations campaign to take a page out of the tobacco industry's playbook and essentially deny the science, as Professor Kiani was referencing. All right, so things are looking a little less optimistic for Plan A. And then 2003, we have President George W. Bush, who literally just walks away from all international climate negotiations altogether. He's not even going to participate in the negotiations at all. Meanwhile, his administration starts doing all sorts of things that are actively hostile to any action on climate, including censoring government climate scientists and so on. All right, so by the mid-early 2000s, things are starting to look grim for Plan A. Amidst all of that, though, there are some bright spots. So 2004, Al Gore releases his movie, right? And you can look at public opinion polling, and that movie actually has a clear impact on public opinion, right? People had started to listen to the fossil fuel industry and think, maybe there's nothing happening here. But following Al Gore's movie, interest in and belief that climate change is happening starts to creep up again. By the end of the Bush administration, public opinion is really shifting. In part, probably in reaction to 8 years of fairly hardline policies on climate and lots of issues from the Bush administration. Another thing happens just 3 years after the movie. The Supreme Court decides a case having to do with climate change and rules in favor of climate action. So essentially, this case presents the question of whether the EPA can use its existing authority under the Clean Air Act of 1970, which doesn't really talk about climate change per se, but it talks about pollution. Can EPA use that authority to regulate greenhouse gases, CO2 and other greenhouse gases? The Supreme Court says yes, right? So this is a big deal. Now EPA can actually use, without Congress doing anything, EPA can do something about climate change. At that time, though, that's the very end of the Bush administration, everybody's thinking, that's great that the Supreme Court said that, but we're not going to need it. Why are we not going to need it? Well, if you think back to the 2008 presidential campaign, both candidates for president that year, Obama and McCain, are both promising that they're going to get passed through Congress big cap and trade legislation to put a price on carbon and do something about the climate crisis, right? These days, this is almost unthinkable that that would be a part of a Republican Party presidential platform, but that's what's happening in 2008, right? So everybody thinks, this is great. We're going to get cap and trade legislation. We don't have to worry about EPA relying on some old statute from 1970, because we're going to get a whole new statute out of Congress, just what we need. We're back on track for Plan A. Congress, international negotiations, it's going to help us. It's going to save us. 2009, first year of the Obama administration, we're totally on track. The cap and trade bill passes through the House of Representatives. Everything's going great until it's not, right? And then what happens? The cap and trade bill goes down in flames in the Senate, and the big climate meeting in Copenhagen in 2009 also sort of goes down in flames. In reality, probably some good things came out of that Copenhagen meeting, but at the time, very much viewed as a complete abject failure, widely viewed as such. So things turn around quickly and it's looking very grim, very, very grim, right? The climate movement's in shambles. They put all their eggs into this big bill in Congress. The bill fails. What do you do next? Well, along comes Plan B, right? And this is where President Obama talks to Lisa Jackson, his administrator of EPA, and says, we're going to have to go back to that Supreme Court case, right? And, you know, interestingly, through all of the negotiations in Congress about the big cap and trade bill, Obama's in there the whole time and he's saying to members of Congress, look, if you don't pass this cap and trade bill, I'm going to do something that you're going to like even less, right? Fossil fuel industry. I'm going to use this old authority under the Clean Air Act of 1970 to have my EPA put old-fashioned regulation on you. You're not going to like that, right? So he was using the 2007 Supreme Court case and this idea that EPA could regulate in this area as like the cudgel, as like the threat to try to get the cap and trade bill through Congress. Well, what's happened? Congress basically called his bluff on that, right? Called his bluff. So now he's got to go back to the EPA and say, all right, EPA, get busy. Do what the Supreme Court gave you the authority to do in 2007. So let's look more carefully at what that 2007 case was really all about, because I know you guys want to hear about the recent Supreme Court case from this past June on climate change. And of course, this is going to help us lay the groundwork for understanding that case as well. So this case of 2007 arises because you've got a bunch of environmental groups who are arguing that EPA is actually required to regulate carbon emissions from cars and trucks under this section 202 of the Clean Air Act. This is the Clean Air Act from 1970. Again, Congress wasn't really thinking about climate change. They talk in terms of pollution and so forth. Section 202 is right there. EPA shall by regulation prescribe standards applicable to the emission of any air pollutant from any class of new motor vehicles which in his judgment cause or contribute to air pollution which may reasonably be anticipated to endanger the public health or welfare, right? So the Bush EPA said, nah, we're not going to do that. We don't think CO2 is an air pollutant within the meaning of the Clean Air Act. So when it says any air pollutant, we think that doesn't include CO2. The Supreme Court 5-4 disagrees and says, nope, CO2 is a pollutant under the Clean Air Act. This is back when you may remember we had Justice Kennedy as the swing vote way back in the days. And Kennedy sides with the liberals. CO2 is a pollutant under the Clean Air Act. And what that means, if you're looking at that language in section 202 there, is that if EPA then concludes that CO2 causes or contributes to air pollution which may reasonably be anticipated to endanger the public health or welfare, then they're going to have to regulate. They're going to have to regulate because it says EPA shall, right? And so essentially that's what the Supreme Court says, look, EPA, CO2 is a pollutant. So now what you have to do is you have to think about this question of whether it's endangering or may reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health. If it is, you're going to have to regulate it, right? So, well, that's the end of the Bush administration. And so at the very beginning, of course, of the Obama administration, it's time to implement this Plan B that has been made possible by the Supreme Court's decision. And so the first thing they do is they issue this endangerment finding. And, you know, Mohammed's introduction, I think, gave you a really clear sense of why EPA at that point, once CO2 was a pollutant, EPA really had no choice but to say that it endangered the public health or welfare. So that was step one. They made this finding, endangerment finding. Once they had done that, they had laid the groundwork to then issue a regulation, which they did jointly with the Department of Transportation, regulating the CO2 coming out of car and truck tailpipes, right? So that was the first step of this Plan B. EPA is going to save us here, right? At that point, the Obama administration kind of looks around, right? And they say, well, what do we do next, right? We did cars and trucks. What do we do next? Well, they undoubtedly looked at this pie chart, right? And at the time, if you looked at where CO2 emissions were coming from, it's roughly a third, a third, a third, as you can see from this pie chart, right? So transportation, what they were dealing with tailpipe standard, is kind of a third. And then there's industrial emissions and some other stuff is another third. But the other big third is the electric power sector, right? And the CO2 emissions coming from the electric power sector, you can see, are primarily from the coal-fired power plants. That's what this big 29.2% of all US emissions coming from coal-fired power plants. So the Obama EPA understandably says that's got to be our next target, right? That's the source of CO2 that we have to go after next. And that's exactly what they do. And they look at the Clean Air Act. And remember, again, they're doing all of this based on a statute passed in 1970. They look to the Clean Air Act and they say, okay, this other section of the Clean Air Act is going to give us authority to regulate the coal-fired power plants. And if we look at this statutory language, we see it looks really familiar, right? So you see that same phrase, right? Does it cause or contribute significantly to air pollution which may reasonably be anticipated to endanger the public health or welfare, right? And this is if some particular category of stationary sources of air pollution, right, buildings with smokestacks, if some category of those sources is endangering the public health or welfare, then the next step is EPA shall regulate that category of sources, right? So they're looking at the category of coal-fired power plants and they say, aha, endangerment, we already got that, right? We already issued an endangerment finding about cars and trucks that showed CO2 is endangering the public health or welfare. We got that covered, right? And so the next step is for them to figure out, okay, we're going to regulate coal-fired power plants. How much do we tell them they got to reduce their CO2 emissions, right? And for that, they look to the section of the statute that tells them what is a standard of performance, right? So this is still the 1970 statute, and it's telling EPA standard of performance is a standard for the emission of air pollutants which reflect the degree of emission limits achievable through the best system of emission reduction that has been adequately demonstrated. So the best system of emissions reduction, that's what EPA has to figure out. What's the best system of emissions reduction for CO2 emissions from coal plants? Well, this is how they think about that. EPA says, well, in this instance, the system is the electricity grid as a whole, right? It's not just the coal plant in isolation. It's the whole electricity grid. And if we think about it that way, then what we say is the best system for emission reduction is basically taking coal plants off the grid and replacing them with wind farms, solar farms, so on and so forth, right? Renewable energy that produces zero carbon. So that is how the Obama EPA reads the statute to come up with their regulation for coal-fired power plants which they then issue in 2015, October of 2015. They call it the Clean Power Plan. There's Obama's second EPA administrator, Gina McCarthy, announcing the Clean Power Plan, right? This thing is going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 32% by 2030.